But there's this tenacious part of not only me, but all of us. We want to live. So I called the psychiatrist that I had been seeing, and she said to me, there's this new drug on the market and I think we should try it. It's called Prozac. And my response to that was, I don't want another drug. And yet when the psychiatrist offered me a possible way out, I immediately jumped for it. And so I tried it. You know, swallow a little biochemical missile and boom, kaboom, you're changed.
The brain contains 100 billion cells, neurons, and they make 100 trillion connections or synapses. And each of the neurons release chemical substances called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are the legal tender of the brain. That's how these cells communicate with each other.
As the neurotransmitters flow through the brain like a river, sending a steady stream of information between the brain's emotional and thinking regions. Just a few milligrams of an antidepressant like Prozac, Zoloft, or Paxil can quickly and radically affect one of them, the mood-influencing chemical serotonin. In the synaptic gap between the neurons, where serotonin delivers messages from one cell to another, sit a series of molecules that work like locks on a canal, regulating the flow of serotonin, determining its rise and fall. In the depressed brain, serotonin is often at low ebb. An antidepressant can plug the entry to some of the molecular locks, forcing serotonin levels to rise in the open spaces between the cells, a change that occurs throughout the brain, but especially in the brain's prefrontal cortex.
And the fact that it occurs in the prefrontal cortex, I think, is very intriguing, since this is the very area that people would have guessed would be a critical area in being able to regulate your mood, for the brain to be able to get itself back on track.
Higher levels of serotonin stimulate a cascade of reactions that bring the brain back into balance. Within weeks, the symptoms of depression mysteriously lift.
What we really want to understand is that last step, that last bit, that change in the wiring, so that the I'm no good changes to maybe things are not so bad. And that is going to take an enormous amount of progress in neuroscience. But when we understand that, we're going to understand very, very important things about what it means to be human, how things go wrong, and how things can go right.
When I first went on Prozac for the first 6 months, were probably the best 6 months of my life. Suddenly I could feel. I could feel pleasure, I could feel happiness, I could feel sadness. It was like this whole range of possibilities. I was walking around stunned. My senses were very different, colors were different, my taste buds were different, my tongue was different. This world was suddenly open to me that I had never really explored before. There are no words to convey how unbelievable that experience was. How much happiness I had.
It has been 12 years since Lauren first found relief from depression. Ever since, she has worked to rebuild her life. She received a doctorate in psychology, married, had a child.
In my more reductive moments, I tend to think, alter serotonin transmission, alter the person, beginning and end of story. But the story, of course, always gets more complicated.
You really are, one of the miracle stories here for this treatment.
I've been on this now for 12 years, and I always feel like, my big concern is that I'm on borrowed time with it. And I know
At this point,
that
it's a borrowed decade.
a borrowed decade, more than a decade
Right.
now, borrowed decade plus 2 years, which is good, but I have to say, I don't know that I'm a Prozac wonder story. I mean, because,
Why?
well, because I started on 10 milligrams and am now, 8 times that, which is why I'm suspicious of the drug. I am very suspicious of the drug,
But Lauren, here's
although I also, of course, am half in love with it, but I am suspicious of it.
the fact that you've been on the stuff, it's been your mainstay, you've been free of symptoms most of the time, we've been able to get you freer of symptoms when you've become symptomatic, is both a nifty thing and one that's unfortunately a little rare in the treatment of chronic severe depression. One rarely sees a depression as severe as yours, which remits as fully as yours has.
I thought, now I have this drug and it's great. I thought I actually had it licked. But then it became a much more complicated relationship. It became I became an unreliable lover, one who had the capacity to save me and yet who could leave me at any moment utterly stranded.
Lauren is not cured of depression. Drugs only relieve the symptoms. And like an infection that resists an antibiotic, Lauren's brain periodically begins to resist the antidepressant. She relapses. Dosages must be increased. Different drugs must be found. Patients call it the Prozac poop out.
My biggest fear with Prozac poop out now is that now that I have a child, it's no longer just me. And I'm afraid that I will not be able to function as a parent. And that will obviously have repercussions for my daughter.
Lauren will always need medication to help her get on with her life, to simply go to work each day. But now she looks beyond her own suffering to helping others.
I think when I was young, I thought I was just lazy. And I think everyone else thought I was just lazy. But it's like when you're at the dentist office and you get like that lead cape put on you. When I'm depressed, I feel like I always have it on.
Now what you're telling me, okay, is that...
Drawing on her own experience with depression, Lauren has become a practicing psychologist, counseling patients at a community clinic in Boston. Like Lauren, many of them take drugs to relieve their depression.
You started off the therapy session saying that you have no resources outside of your doctors and your medication. You'd be a puddle of sugar should I and your psychopharmacologist and I guess and the pills themselves suddenly fly away. But when we look, I think that drug therapy probably gives a leg up, the ability to become symptom-free enough so that you can learn new ways of behaving. But I resist in myself and in other people being reduced simply to a series of biochemistry, or biochemical interactions. So in some ways I insist on there's got to be some kind of therapeutic process here that's not just talking about our synapses. You yourself told me that you've built a support network. You've come out of the closet with your depression, and that really helps. And these are all of the coping mechanisms that you have. The fact is that you have resources inside of you.
For many people, drugs alone are not enough to keep depression at bay. Research has demonstrated that the most effective way to treat depression is with a combination of drugs and talk therapy.
Talk therapy works because it works on the brain. Anytime we learn something new, anytime we change our mind about something, anytime we remember something, we can do that only by changing the physical structure of our brain, by changing, literally, synaptic connections so that we're processing information differently.